All right, I will call to order the March 9th, 2023 City of Oak Park Heights Planning Commission meeting at 6 p.m. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, there were some agendas on the back table if you needed one, and I think everybody else has an agenda. Do we have any adjustments or anything? Otherwise, I'd ask for approval.
Make a motion to approve. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
No.
Hearing no discussion, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passed. All right, there were last month, February 9th minutes back on the back table for anyone who wanted to review them. Do we have any comments or adjustments needed to the minutes last month? Otherwise, I'd ask for approval.
I'd like to move that we approve them as written.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Do we have any department or updates tonight? Is there anything going on that we want to learn about?
Well, only thing I
Just
could
thinking
add,
of it now.
yeah, because I try, you try not to talk, right? Sometimes it's fun to say that, and sometimes it's fun it isn't. Anyway, so the council is lobbying, our city has been lobbying our legislature for funding for the King Plant redevelopment site. And as we all know those things. So one interesting piece of that puzzle is the state House did pass $1.9 billion infrastructure bond Monday or Tuesday?
Just real quick, right?
Well, no, yeah. But in that list, which is relatively limited to compared to, I think, the massive slate of requests coming in statewide, is that the city's request was part of that bill. So 2.19 million was in the bill. It's passed at the House. We'll work with our legislator at the Senate, Senator Housley, who's been very supportive of all our work. And so those dollars would be slated for pre-design, design, and right-of-way acquisition. So we'll see what happens.
Nice. I know they've been lobbying a lot at the Capitol for us. So
Yeah.
It's nice to have good representatives.
They've done a great job.
Anything from you, Scott?
Nope.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So moving on, this is an opportunity for the public to address the commission with questions or concerns on issues that are on or not part of the regular agenda tonight. Please limit these comments to 3 minutes in length. Is there any visitor or public comments? Oh. All right.
Seeing none.
Seeing no visitor or public comments, we'll move on to public hearings. Mr. Richards?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. We have discussed this at your January and your February 2023 meetings. Again, I think we're making progress as we move along, especially in terms of the parking requirements. I did not see any changes really to the draft. Anything that's new in this draft is shown in red. Other previous changes we made are the black bold, but red stands out with the new discussion over the last couple months. The first I'd like to start at is the discussion just on the general parking about accessory off-street parking, the parking for residential, additional parking adjacent to a driveway. And what we had discussed, if you notice on page 9 at the top, exception to these provisions of the section is by conditional use permit. The discussion was if they want to make an exception to any of these regulations, we allow them to do it by CUP. Previously or currently, it would be by variance. So we felt you wanted, from my notes, you wanted to have some process in place if there is a variation in that. So That was the thought there. In number 7, in the middle of the page, we struck the language and/or storage of snow for the open storage sale, rental goods, repair work, storage of inoperable vehicles, cutting into the required off-street parking spaces. At the bottom of that page, there's discussion again on language, and hopefully I captured this. It makes sense to me, but it's got to make sense to everyone in terms of number of spaces required. The following are the, and I added the language, the following are the minimum/maximum required number of off-street parking spaces that will be provided. So hopefully that clarifies that. And then there really were no changes to any of the parking standards. Again, for the public, we've essentially for most of the parking standards, we've cut them in half. And we went through a number of them at the last meeting. It seemed to make sense where we're going with a lot of them. In fact, we're cutting some of those parking standards down to what we're seeing that's more common in the industry out there. So again, it should help. Hopefully, as a minimum and maximum number of stalls, reduce the overall number of stalls that are required for everything. You know, we're just seeing in this world, especially with certain uses, as much parking as what was built out there isn't really required anymore. So I thought that was a good step. One thing on page 14, though, you know, I keep going back and forth on this, and this is something that we discussed a little bit at our last meeting. Is should the varying, right now it requires a conditional use permit if you want to reduce or increase the number of required off-street parking spaces. And we've used the conditional use permit process in the past, but is it something we want to be able to do administratively? The reason I go back and forth on it is in most places where we have a change in parking, fields of parking, it's going to require site plan review anyway, and have to go through the planning commission and city council. But in other, and we've never not approved them. So is it just something that can be done administratively? And we can discuss
We
that.
can discuss that at the public hearing. We'll talk about that here in a minute.
Well, we can wait for the discussion, but I just wanted to bring that out. And then the big item, the thing that we're grappling the most with is the provisions for parking lot landscaping and increasing the amount of landscaping for both the big and small parking spaces. And Eric was able to pull off the internet some really nice clear images, and he can scroll through them as we discuss them. Some clear images of the Aldi, Stillwater Crossing, that's where Carboni's is at, a Pizza Ranch in the area around Suds Car Wash. And pull those out just so we can get a visual of what those spaces look like. So there's that, but we did increase on page 15 under parking lot landscaping. We talked about going from the threshold for where this starts. Originally said 25 spaces. I bumped that up to 50. I think we had that discussion, thought that seemed more reasonable for these regulations to kick in, starting with stalls of 50 or more. As you can see the examples that we've got. Aldi's 83, Stillwater Crossing 102, Pizza Ranch 92, Suds Car Wash 63. So I think that's a reasonable starting point. And then. Again, the 8x8 size of the minimum parking lot islands, again, to support larger trees rather than, I always love to use Kathy Wyden's tree coffin expression, but that's essentially what, the 3 feet wide parking islands tend to be. So again, that's a big plus. And then 800 square feet for 50 parking spaces. And of course that varies depending. If you got a parking lot of 63 stalls, then it's slightly more than 800. You have to factor that in. As you see, like Suds Car Wash is actually a little over 1,000 square feet as a requirement. So, went through the math and talked about that. On that last page, example, again, Aldi, Stillwater Crossing, Pizza Ranch, and Suds Car Wash, based upon the formula of 800 square feet per 50, the square footages there are listed for each. And then what the number of stalls it would require to accomplish that. One thing that wasn't, and I didn't make that clear, one thing that wasn't factored into those numbers are the existing green areas that are already in those parking lots. So this would just be the maximum requirement. And when I went through and looked at those a little bit more, I should add another column, but it just occurred to me in the last couple days that Aldi, for instance, already has roughly 9 spaces of parking already, so they would more than meet that requirement. Stillwater Crossing, if you look at that lot, they really don't have any peninsulas or any parking, so they would have to add, again, if they're going to redo their entire parking lot, reconfigure things and so forth, they would have to add at least the equivalent of 9 stalls of parking in landscaping. Pizza Ranch right now has about equivalent to 4 stalls of parking. They would have to increase the amount of landscaping by 4. And then the Suds Car Wash area, again, Suds has that large landscape island right in the middle. You know, they're already providing roughly the equivalent of more than adequate, you know, probably 15 stalls of area that it's hard to explain that. 15 spaces roughly the equivalent of parking they already have in green space. So again, more than adequate to meet that. Which I question when I start looking at it, is that 800 square feet enough? You know, considering you look at Aldi, you know, if you're happy with that, for the numbers of, or for the size of those landscape islands, you know, they meet that requirement. You know, the Suds area, more than, like, twice as much green area as what we would now require. I think the biggest thing we're accomplishing is turning those smaller islands into larger islands. They're just probably fewer just because they're larger. So something to mull over and something to discuss. So with that, we can go back to the public hearing, I guess.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Richards. It's 6:13. We'll open the public hearing for the urban heat islands tonight. Is there anyone from the public that would like to make a comment?
I was going to say that,
Oh, yeah, we can talk
I
about this.
remember to bring
we'll
that
talk
up.
about that too.
Jim Kramer, 5475 Oak Green Place North. As you are aware, for the last several months, you, the Planning Commission, as well as the City Council, has been discussing parking issues and doing it in terms of, I mean, it came up as a result of talking about heat islands. It seems to me that the first thing that one should think about doing is decoupling the whole idea of heat islands from parking requirements. There is, as far as I can tell, there is zero evidence that Oak Park Heights is creating temperature changes or rises in the surrounding area, and therefore it really is not, in a traditional sense, any sort of heat island. That said, it does seem to me that it's a wise thing to think about changing parking. And I think it's an ideal time for us to really think about how can we simplify the parking ordinance. I guess looked at from a different perspective, is it really necessary for a city of 5,000 people to have 16 pages of rules for parking? Seems to me that it is not. Do we really need 40 designations of different usages for parking? can anyone explain why a major bus terminal and a garden supply store need the same number of parking spaces? And that's what is required in, on page 10, 9A. What's the rationale behind measuring church pews and coming up with the idea that 22 inches is a seat and used for calculating? And that's on page 4, G2. Why is it okay, for example, on page 8, H19, to say that, quotes, "You need adequate space for snow storage shall be provided on the site." But it's not okay to say adequate parking shall be provided. So why does it make sense if we're talking about requirements? Why can we be vague to say adequate space for snow, but it's too vague to say adequate space for parking? Now, I've been told that the reason for all of these distinctions and changes and little minuscule distinctions is because of lawsuits, and we need to prevent lawsuits. Well, I went back, and in the last 30-plus years, there's actually been 2 lawsuits in Minnesota. One of them was about parking. One of them was in St. Paul, and I think about 1980 or something like that, where a guy sued because of his $3 parking ticket, which would not be corrected by this. The other one had to do with, I think, in Hugo, Minnesota, or one of the outlying areas where somebody parked a semi on somebody else's property. Neither of those instances would be, in fact, cured by our parking ordinance. And in fact, if you really think about it, the ordinances are so detailed that it is because of that detail that you could potentially end up with lawsuits. Because basically, one could easily argue that many of the distinctions are made for no reason at all. They're basically capricious distinctions that, for example, you have discriminated against a church because of the 22-inch requirement per pews or whatever. So I think the fact of the matter is that the more detailed it gets, the more us attorneys find areas that we can pick at and sue if that's what one wishes to do. So again, my thing is it's a great time to talk about parking, but it should be massively simplified. So what I would suggest is that just start out with the purpose and simplify that. The goal of these regulations is to prevent or lessen congestion on the street of the city, thereby making it safer for citizens and all who come here, rather than 3 sentences long. Then I would delete sections, for example, A through E. And I would, my final thing would be when we're talking about calculating space, why not fall back on our 17 different zoning? We have 17 zoning areas, different kinds. Attach parking figures. If you're this type of zoning, this is the parking requirement. So you'd only have basically 17 rules, because your zone would tell you what kind of parking you should have. And then allow, I think as Mr. Richards has suggested, that there's administrative oversight to this and look at it, and that's where the, without having to go through all kinds of rigmarole, the administrative people sit down with the business or whatever and work out. And I think most places are willing to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman, or Mr. Kramer. Yeah.
We'll slip the tongue.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Carly Johnson, and I'm here today in front of you as a member of the public. I live at 4418 57th Street North, just down the street from City Hall. Well, I have not been at every one of your meetings. I have watched every single one, and as Commissioner Freeman pointed out, I was trying to solve and answer your questions through the TV. So I'm hoping I can kind of clarify a few things right now while I'm here. The first that was kind of brought up in the last remarks is why this first came about. Yes, part of the conversation was about heat islands, but it was also more complicated than that. We've been recognizing up at City Hall long before my tenure on the council that we have too many parking spots that are going unused. We're also at full build out, so this will allow for redevelopment of those parking spaces, which the landlords of the Kowalski's build property have already looked into prior to these discussions. Also, as part of the memo that was presented before you, our city has been ineligible for grant funding for Emerald Ash Borer, as Lisa pointed out at our Parks Commission meetings, because we don't have sufficient tree diversity, which goes back to that question at the first meeting, which is the 15-20-10 policy. As for some grants, they require that you have no more than 15% of any particular species, 20% or more of any one genus, and no more than 10% of any one family. So having those bigger, more landscaping requirements will allow for us to hopefully get closer to that goal. I just want to thank you so much for your time and considering these policies and all of the thought you've given to them, and I really appreciate it, so thank you.
Thank you. All right, do we have anyone else that would like to comment during the public hearing? Seeing no one, I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
Make a motion to close the public hearing.
Second.
Do we have any additional discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Public meeting, or public hearing is closed at 6:22. All right. Who wants to go first?
I'm ready. I'm always ready, but I'm ready today. I guess the first, I want to go through my list of things that I marked up about here. And then I want to address what Mr. Kramer had to say. The first item that I marked up, and I don't have much, it seems like we have two sections in here that conflict with one another. If we look on the bottom of page 9, number of spaces required, the following are the minimum maximum, and then it says maintained by ownership, easement, and/or lease for the during and life, the respective uses here and after set forth. But then, if you back up to page 8, item number 6A, it says you can't have parking that counts unless you own it. So what happened to the easements and the lease? And none of this is anything that was changed. It's just something that when I read through it, it's like, so which is it? Do you get to have leased property? Easement property where you have parking, or does it only count when you own it? And I'm not trying to say which one I prefer. I'm just saying that it shouldn't be.
They should be consistent.
Should be consistent. So, yeah. And I'm not sure how that happened. A lot of times when we get these ordinances, we take them from a different community and then we craft them to our own.
Right.
Our own uses and that.
I would say that we reflect the language on page 9, that, as long as they're ownership, easement, or lease, as long as the spaces are there, so maybe we should be consistent.
Well, and I was reading the verbiage on 6A, it's referring to the use of the facility there, right? It's the principal use, so it's kind of vague there, so I think that makes sense, Mr. Richards, to adjust that.
Okay.
I think it just says, though, that it has to be under the same ownership, and the reason why I agree that, leases and easements are probably the way to go is that there are plenty of places in this city that there's multiple users that have parking that are sharing it. And if they have a shared parking lease with each other or agreement, churches are a great example of where people try and use their parking during the week because they only use it on the weekends. And the businesses are doing the same. When there's a bunch of businesses in one big lot, they all, the property lines might go through the middle of the lot, but that doesn't mean that's where the parking should go. So anyways, just something to bring up.
Yep, that's a good catch.
Commissioner Freeman, can I ask a question on that?
Of course.
Okay, so you mentioned on page 8 in
6A.
6A, so, and that would be conflicting again with which one was it?
With number 9 on page 9, number of spaces required, and it just
Right.
refers to shall be provided and maintained by ownership, easement, and/or lease for and
Right.
during the life of the respective use.
Okay,
So it
that
just-
makes sense.
One says you have to own it, and the other one says you can lease it.
So one of the challenges we've had over the years, again, down these rabbit holes we go, but it's good to understand where the rabbit holes are. Owner of property X doesn't use his or her space. They then want to lease it to the abutting property owner or a non-abutting property owner. I just want to park cars here from, some other enterprise. What then can happen and has happened then is they then have given away their rights, and now we have overflow, or now we have other conflicts there. The most recent example I can tell you right now is the space behind Tire Pro's new car wash. If you go up there and you look at all the cars parked there, none of those are, I should say none, but many of those parked there on a regular basis are not patrons of those facilities. They're just parking there. To your other point, yes, there are cross easements that are part of a development, part of a PUD, part of a conditional use permit, part of the development, and I don't think we're saying that. But there is a rationale as to why we say, why there's a history of ownership being the primary parameter. That is the history there. And so, just so you know, whether good or bad, that's what happens. I don't know if it changed anything, but that's.
Well, and I get that. I mean, I do. I think that if you have a project that you're trying to get approved, and you come to me because I got more parking area on my lot,
Right.
and you want to use that, it needs to be taken off of what I'm using.
Right, you need to sell or grant a
lease.
permanent easement.
Yep.
And then your granting of a permanent easement can't put then you in violation.
Right.
And that's what can happen.
Right.
And so that's why the term ownership is critical.
And it's important the way it's phrased there, I think, and I'm understanding what you're saying, because it's referring to the use. Right. It's not. It's got to be the same ownership as the principal use being served.
Correct.
So it's for the purpose of what it's being used for. In section number 9, we're talking about off-street parking and number of spaces that need to be provided, maintained by. It's a different purpose in
Correct.
6A as it is in 9. They're referring to different things.
We can maybe
But-
clean it up a little, but I
Yeah.
think that is what the history is, Scott. You
Yeah, I'm
can
not
correct
getting my
me.
head around this, but
Yeah,
I'll let me think about it.
I didn't.
I think we're splitting some hairs.
I didn't think I came with an answer. I came with a question. So I was
Yeah,
hoping that
yeah.
something that you can look over and make
Well,
sure that.
I'll talk it over with you.
It's all very exciting.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Well, and to what Mr. Kramer had to say, it's like, what would we do on Thursday evenings if we didn't have stuff like this to talk
They
about?
are.
So, I mean, if you don't have a big, fat
It's better than Thursday
book of
night TV.
rules, I mean,
But that's the history we had with it, and so it's important you knew. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Makes sense.
I'm gonna,
Go
I don't have a lot more.
Okay.
What was the other one? The last time I did this, I read through most of my pages and then went, oops. The landscaping thing that we just talked about, I just wrote this one down. If we're on page 15 and 16, all the red area that we have there, I'm not clear what the suggestion is about when you have 50 stalls and 800 square feet of landscaping required. Is that, I mean, we have setback areas around the outside of properties that typically are landscaped. We have percentage of impervious surface that's allowed and not allowed, which typically the stuff that's not impervious is going to be landscape. Are we adding that we have to have islands that normally wouldn't be part of it, and that's what we're adding on there, or are we talking about the total landscaping on the site?
No, you're talking, because it specifically refers to parking lot islands or peninsulas, so it's pretty clear. So the area around Aldi that's all green doesn't count. It's what we're trying to do is reduce that sea of asphalt with some intermittent, landscape islands.
I spent a lot of time picking people's ordinances apart to find ways to have my
To get around
clients
them, yeah.
So, Suds Car Wash, where are their islands? You said they've got just a huge amount of islands. I don't see
Well,
any islands.
it's not Suds, it's the development in front, but look at the large field of green area there.
Well, the large field of green's got a road through it right now. I know that because I staked it last winter, but that's now the parking area for the Starbucks.
At the Starbucks.
But anyway,
but
what I'm
that's
saying is
exempt.
that Suds and their ownership doesn't have any islands. Would this require them to put islands?
Well,
I think there's a lot of green area around them, and they don't look like a business that's creating a heat island issue at all, or even excessive impervious surface. When you look at, there's a triangle of ponding area and all of the landscaping, and
and I would argue
extra
that
large right-of-ways.
Suds, the way it's at least designed here before the changes, does really accomplish what we're trying to do
On Suds, where?
in the middle of the island, if that was still there.
That's a different ownership, though. I mean, it's a different lot.
We're not talking about Suds, we're actually talking about the area
Oh, okay.
of around it.
But when,
It's just- yeah.
when my client hires me to design a Suds car wash on that property, I'm gonna have to put islands in there, aren't I? Because
Well,
you took their square footage
If you're
and the
talking,
number of lots.
if you're talking specifically about Suds now and not
Yep.
the shopping center, Suds would have fewer than 50 parking spaces, so they wouldn't be required.
Okay.
That's why I have that
I'm not
threshold.
trying to, I'm not coming with answers.
No, but that's,
the question
to have
guy.
that set eyes that you, and that
Yep.
perspective you have is important.
The shopping center would have to put that island back in that they just took out.
Oh, gosh, no. They did that before this ordinance went in.
Correct.
Which
They put
again
it-
answers Mr. Kramer's question about why we So those are the questions that I had, the comments that I had. And the thing that I do want to specifically say about what Jim had to offer is I agree with you about simplifying the ordinances. And I agree with you that people like me that are looking for ways around them, I'm looking for words that tell me what I can do. And most people think that this is what tells you you can't do, but it really is the other way around. So the more words, the easier it is for me to find ways around things. So in principle, I agree with what you said, Jim, but the thing that I don't want to do is spend the next year and a half making this ordinance smaller. You know what I mean? These ordinances come from other cities, and people, every time somebody gets away with something, they put in another thing in their ordinance, and that's how these ordinances grow.
A lot of the, looking over the years at ordinances built in the 50s and 60s were very, very minimal.
Yep.
And the reason that we now have 16 pages is because those ordinances were so minimal, because there's always ways around them, because they weren't clear. They were so open to interpretation. That's why we've inserted all this detail.
Yep.
And from a staff perspective, it's easier for me to have the language there than try to anticipate or imagine what they were meaning by it. And that's why what Jim had mentioned about the lawsuits, that was mainly related to definitions and why we have pages and pages of definitions. Well, that's all based upon someone was questioning and didn't, the Webster's dictionary, which is the default, didn't clarify it in zoning perspectives, so you put in another definition.
I have to tell you,
There's so many times I've been able to hang my hat on a definition because it's there and is specific to zoning, that it's saved us.
And I
that's
can
my
tell you,
perspective.
from the other side of the fence, the only time that I stand up and read ordinances to planning commissions and city councils is when I'm reading definitions. And they tell me, you can't do this. And I say, well, it's funny that you say that, because in On page 3.
But our definitions are better than everyone else's.
Okay.
But that's because there's 18 pages of definitions instead of 16 pages of parking.
All right, let's move on.
Well, I mean, that's
Yeah.
what I wanted to say, and
Yeah.
that's my point about what he says, is I don't really want to spend a lot of time chopping it up and making it more smaller, but I certainly agree
Someday,
with what the principle is.
someday, and hopefully I'm long gone, this city probably should spend the money to update its zoning ordinance and completely from scratch.
Yep,
But I don't want to do it.
I'm with you. I'm with you. You know, and the other thing is that when we take a survey of the area that's yet to be developed in Oak Park Heights, and think about a town with 5,000 people, what are we preparing for here? There's really nothing left to do.
The challenge you
nothing,
have,
but-
though, with
Huh?
ordinances is, play devil's advocate, just, we philosophically, none of us like rules. I mean, nobody should say, but the minute those rules benefit us or protect us, boy, we want the city to be there and have sword and shield in hand. And I can't tell you how many times we are that defense. And I mean, it's not heroic, it's not anything, it's just what it is. So you get the good with the bad. It just is. And
I don't disagree that this is complicated,
yeah,
but this is the norm in the world we live.
yeah.
And this is the norm we need to stay in, because the majority of cities that we hire professionals to look at write ordinances like this, and there's a reason behind that. Otherwise, they would be simple, like the public comment tonight was, it would be nice to have it simplified, but there's a reason this exists, and there's a reason that if we go look at White Bear Lake or Stillwater, any of our neighboring communities, their ordinances are similar, and there's a reason for it. And appreciate the comment, and I appreciate the reasoning, and I don't disagree with it. I just understand there's a reason for it, and that's why communities have it. Commissioner Freeman, do we have more?
No, I think I've gotten to say what I wanted to say.
I probably am saying this out of turn, so I apologize. I probably should have said it at the public hearing, but we did receive a note that we want to talk about a little bit, just applying that there was a letter sent in talking about adding water to the islands could potentially be a challenge. Just being able to trench water for watering the plants or trees is something to take into consideration that we should probably talk about a little bit here. And then his request was just understanding the definition around the number of stalls, whether they're continuous or if they're like in multiple different shapes.
What?
Just to think about, and I think we've kind of talked about some of that with the number of stalls and the spacing required for the stalls, but I do think just understanding maybe some of the water challenges might be something that's worth a little bit of a conversation here.
I think he's also talking about the 25 stalls was too small, and it should be 100, and I think you said you changed it to 50.
We changed it.
Yep.
So, and I think that's his complaint, is that
25 is
don't make it, yeah, you're gonna make it difficult for those smaller, and that the mass in one big area, like the parking in the Menards lot is different than the stuff that goes around that, a strip mall, You might have a lot of them on there, but they wouldn't, where would you put the islands,
To Scott and Julie's credit, they made the effort to, so who could we call that in our community that is small, and reached out, and Eric Bielen's been before this board many times, and you would recognize his face, and he's been good to work with, and he gave us his fair input. I mean, we can put an ad in the paper, but big deal. Let's reach out to a few folks, and Scott and Julie
Yeah, Eric
did
was a
that.
good resource for things like that. So. Trust
And,
his.
and I do think it is a valid note, and I think we've taken that 25 to 50. So I think that is.
But I think it's, as you said, Mr. Chair, it's worth discussing. There's a lot of expense in maintenance and installation of irrigated islands, and
Especially in a situation where water is becoming, not necessarily in Minnesota, but in other parts of the world, a commodity that's more or less readily available.
I think if you're just talking about islands only, it's difficult for somebody to spend the money to irrigate the island when it's extended and away from the building. I mean, you're talking about trying to not only put that in there, but keep it blown out and what, I mean, it's,
the one thing, again,
expensive.
going from 3 to 8 in width makes up a lot of that. or it makes it easier for those trees to actually survive because they are getting more moisture. So, I've been on the fence on that one, and I'm glad he brought that up, because I thought, we haven't really discussed that. And, I could go either way on it, but I defer to this discussion.
To my way of thinking, I think this puts some burden back on the city, but to tell somebody they have to do irrigation and think, well, okay, now we're done with it, I think it should be more something about the trees that you get credit for on your site plan need to live, and if they don't, you need to replace them. And that'll be the watering, or however, they do it with a truck, or they go out there with a barrel, who cares how they do it, but just saying that if you irrigate it, well, they put an irrigation system in, and they never start it up in the spring, and the trees die, it's still missing the
It doesn't
point.
say that they have to turn it on in the spring. That's a good
Well, and, again, that's just me, the way I read ordinances, but
I
the
like
point
that.
is
I like that angle that
trying to make them live,
that we that we have them make sure that they maintain what they've got.
Yeah.
I think make sure
Which I think
they
we do to a
maintain,
certain extent now.
which we
right?
have already, I think, to a certain extent. But where I'm going with this is, I think what Ms. Johnson talked about tonight is, I think that we need to rely on our local arborists to provide solid recommendations to create the diversity that is requested to receive these bonds and grants that we've talked about from the public comments tonight. I think we need to make sure that there is a focus put forth on our arborists to say, all right, this kind of tree or this kind of bush or this kind of flower is going to survive without irrigation in a normal Minnesota summer. And you plant things at certain times of the year so you don't have to water trees, like you don't put them in July, right? So I think there should be some emphasis made by staff, if we move down this path, that we utilize our internal city resources so that they make the right decisions. So we don't go back to them later and say, all right, they're all dead, you have to replace them, that costs more money.
Knowing Lisa like we do, she is very active in that right now, and she would, I think all of us would say, yeah, that's, if we can clarify that further, that's great. I think the most recent one we're dealing with fundamentally right now, and a very similar issue, is the Chase Bank redevelopment that's happening right now. So they were advised in the memo by Lisa that, hey, you need to change what they planted. You didn't follow the memo or follow the guideline we provided. So, and that was part of their conditional use permit process, that they had to follow what the arborist specified. And it wasn't a very particular list where it has to be this, but rather here's the gamut of trees you could use. So we reached back out to them and said, you need to change these. So I think that
Yeah, Lisa's very good about reviewing those landscape plans and pointing out where you've got 55 ash trees, and sorry, you can't do that. You have to do a more diverse. She's actually very good at that.
Well, I just want to make that clear, because I do think we are asking for probably potentially some additional workload from staff.
yeah, no, that's not a, it's already being done.
But I
So-
think D, getting back to that, instead of mandating irrigation, I like the wording that the trees need to be maintained and replaced
Yeah.
as per the approval of the city arborist.
And you'd think those businesses would want to do that anyways, but
Yeah, but not always.
I think we should add 10 more pages to the parking ordinance so that we can
We
make
could.
sure that every little,
So out of all
Kowalski's,
seriousness, I'm going to move on from that joke.
So I have a question. So with those grants for the emerald ash borer, how does that, I'm trying to understand in my mind, so is that money that would be going to the city, or is that money that would be going to the individual? If it's their property, I'm trying to understand, how does that money go?
So we can
Unless you
ask,
don't-
well, yeah, no, we can
Get into it,
we can ask for the specifics behind that in the future, but I think the long and short about that, since we closed the public hearing, is that there are opportunities for grants with Emerald Ash Borer. We don't know the details about it, but I know that cities are provided mitigation money depending on how many ash trees are existing in the city, and our city doesn't have that much diversity apparently. So, but we can ask specifics about that outside. I don't think that is
Got it.
pertinent to this conversation.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to dive in here. I don't have as much as Tim. But to one of the points that was asked in here that we haven't answered is, should the stalls be a CUP or review, administrative review and approval? I think you mentioned it, but we need to agree probably on what should be done. I'm under the impression that it should be city review and not a CUP. This seems like, why does every single person, churches, businesses have to come in front of us to say, I have a CUP because my landscape island isn't big enough? That seems like a waste of 6 people's time. That's my 2 cents.
You know, it rises to the fact that, is this something that really requires public input or a public hearing? You know, it's more something that the city engineer, the administrator, and the planner can say, yeah, this makes sense.
That's
You know,
my...
who's going to come to that public hearing? We have to think about that.
The same, oh no, there are 2 people here today. This is probably the first, this is the first public hearing we've had in a really long time where there's been more than one person come to talk, so.
Okay, so if you want to hear a flip side,
Yeah, here's
Please
Eric's
do.
website.
all right. So being the person who gets to sometimes be that arbiter isn't necessarily. I mean, it's not hard and complicated, but you'd like to fall back to a standard that provides just a very clear, bright line for us to make decisions. Well, you gave it to him. Why can't you give it to her? Well, they're not the same. You know, what are really the circumstances? So maybe there's a way to phrase it. This may be approved administratively if X, or
I have a feeling it could be as easy as if the lot or property is under redevelopment or whatever. If it's just Kohl's changing hands from Kohl's to Home Depot, they're not changing anything. It's just new ownership. I feel like that would
Yeah,
be
we
a
wouldn't.
city easy breeze through.
yeah,
the
that we would
ordinance.
do that. But I don't know if that's what you're trying to say, Scott. Is
I'm just saying that every time, let's say they are doing redevelopment there, does it require the burden of a conditional use permit?
not necessarily. I mean, if it's just changing ownership, no, because it
Well,
doesn't
in order-
change the use.
Yeah, and maybe that needs to be clarified, because the intent isn't when the Kohl's goes to some other retailer,
Right.
that doesn't trigger it. It's actually when they tear out the asphalt and redo it, sort of
Well,
thing.
and
That's really what's.
Maybe the thing is that when there's a site plan review, they're going through the process anyways. So why would the staff want to try and take that on themselves?
Yeah, and that's-
If they're doing a site plan review, they're coming here anyway.
They're
so.
coming here anyway.
So-
And that's why I go back and forth on
Yeah,
it.
I mean, that's kind of the way I feel about it. I'm not interested in making more work for the planning commission unless it's real work.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's real things to do, great, but if we're here to, look at some of these obvious requests and say, well, yeah, okay.
But-
Open the
but-
public
but-
hearing, let's
I
close it,
like
let's-
Eric's approach that, and there's some language that you built in that says if there is just minor changes to the parking lot, that staff can approve it. But if they're doing actual site plan review or other zoning type of things, they got to come in for a CUP.
Right.
Maybe that's the way to
I
handle
think
it.
what we've done historically, I would argue, and Scott, you correct me. I think the stuff that we deal with out in the field or that comes to our city in the development world, we do our best to not have them hassle or go through a process that we're probably just kicking stuff out. Yeah, just do it. Just, find a way around it, get it done and moving along. I think we really do that now as best we can within some scope of reality.
I would agree with that. From the other side of the fence, I would agree that the city's pretty good about.
Just keep stuff moving,
just-
right?
Yep.
And
I like that, so.
So yeah, let me work on some language on that. I think that's good.
Okay, I had a couple other points before, and I don't want to drag the heat island thing out too far, but the point that Mr. Freeman made about the not conflicting language, understanding the 50 per 800, I think 12B is clear if we're really going to go down to that granularity of how it's written. The struggle that I'm having is this 8 by 8, and we're talking about landscaping, i.e. trees. Really, the people at Kohl's, to pick on them, could use bushes, they could use They don't-
Smaller trees like crab
Nothing is
apples.
forcing them, or the Stillwater Crossing guy, it's not forcing them to bring trees. They could just have
Just greenery.
greenery in an island. We don't want rocks. We need some sort of green thing. So these Coles and Stillwater Crossing are so interesting to me because Coles has the room to make it 8x8, put in trees big enough to survive the whole gamut. Stillwater Crossing doesn't. If we have people like them that don't have room, that are constantly full, and they need to put in peninsulas and islands and whatever, they're not going to have enough room to put trees, so it has to be something shrubbery. And
But if they want to, let me think about that. If someplace like Stillwater Crossings, if they've got a Carbones parking issue, and they don't want to comply with that, they always have the ability to come to the city and say, these are the reasons, city, why I have this issue. So there's always an outlet for that process.
so I think with all that being said, though, why aren't we, so I appreciate the whole thing is parking. Asphalt is the heat causer. We're talking about parking. Why aren't we expanding the scope, simplifying the whole thing, and talking about the lot? If your lot is this big, we expect this much green space. So all of that combined, it could be grass, it could be trees, it could be the islands, it could be the peninsulas. But why aren't we talking about general green space? Because Stillwater Crossing has that frontage. They don't comply to maybe some of the parking lot specificity, but they're able to plant the trees and fill their green space, get the broad spectrum tree planting that the city needs. to get
Because
the
that may
grants.
not accomplish what we're looking for. What we're trying to accomplish is putting some green space in the middle of those parking lots. Or, I would argue that Stillwater Crossing could have some islands along here, some peninsulas, let's say. And again, with the canopy of a tree, you're reducing that amount of asphalt.
But they could also put the trees in the frontage between their parking lot and the roundabout.
Yeah, specifically what we're saying though is we're trying to reduce the sea of asphalt. And what we're trying to accomplish again is, not just around the edge, but within the middle also.
Yep, I appreciate that. It just, yeah.
Yeah, I know, it's,
So I like the example of the Suds Car Wash parking lot renovation.
Pre-parking lot
for Starbucks,
renovation.
right? That to me shows what the purpose of this whole conversation we've had for the last 3 months is you don't want that to be one big black square. You want it to be something in the middle to break that up. Right. And I agree with what you said, Commissioner Husby, about the Stillwater Crossings is, I think, a unique structure where it's such a curvature in L, and we've got that whole new space down below that's coming from MnDOT, maybe for additional parking. That's a unique piece in the city, and I think we built some provisions in to prevent that from being a problem if they want to come talk about it, right? I think those are built, don't you, Mr. Richards?
yeah, I think so too. So I want to play a little bit more with this language and also run in my head maybe a few more examples and those square footages to see if they make sense.
Can I give you something else to think about?
Yeah.
From my point of view?
Sure.
If islands are, if islands are included, or peninsulas are included, what's to stop the city from telling me that my peninsulas that come in from the outside of the parking lot aren't the same as the exterior part of the parking lot? And you can't, just because the peninsula sticks out, that's part of the outside area, so you don't get credit for that.
So let's look at the Aldi plan. See the peninsula that comes out at that entrance point? Actually, there's two of them. They're relatively small.
Yep.
So explain now what you're talking
But
about.
what I'm saying is, the city could say, well, we're not including that because that's part of the exterior planting you're going to do anyways.
Oh,
I just wanted you to think about it. Because
Yeah, my intent-
You see, my point is that pretty soon, the only thing that's going to count are islands, and you're going to be planting islands in the middle of parking lots just
my
to get the
intent is
square footage done.
that's a peninsula that counts. And maybe we need to clarify that.
Right.
Again, a longer ordinance, because
I'm
we
just-
have to clarify it, but
Yep.
that's what we get into. But that was the intent, and
I got that.
and that's what you're thinking of too, is like,
should
the
count.
city could say, oh, yeah, well, that's
Oh,
part of
no, that's part of the outside part.
Part of
You
the
can't do
outside
that,
part.
You know, so whatever, right?
Okay, good, that's good.
That's all I have.
Har har.
Mr. Husby, Ms. Van Dyke, do we have anything else
heard
we
from you
want
at
to
all?
discuss about?
No?
I'm done.
You're done?
Everything's too varied, it's too complex, I don't know. Come up with the best thing you can, and then if they can't do it, like St. Clair Crossing, then they have to come to the city and talk to them, I guess. I don't know, and then they can talk to us.
Yep.
I don't think there's any one way that's good, so.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. It's a complicated, it's a challenging situation. We've been through this 4 revisions, right? And
It's not an easy thing.
No, it's a complicated challenge, and we really appreciate all the work staff's put into this. We appreciate what the recommendations from the public is. We appreciate all the work you've done.
Every parking lot is different, you know, every site is different. So it's hard to write regulations for something like this that fits.
Everybody
one
ride your
person.
bikes.
But I appreciate that
There's
comment,
a-
though,
there's-
Ms. Van Dyke, because it is a challenge, right?
rats.
It's a messy, what
I'm
is it,
adding
15
F that
pages long?
says, yeah.
I just don't think, I think.
Credit given for bike
like,
racks.
When Tyler brought up the point about all these being so much smaller, I mean, we want to, I mean, as somebody in the community, I want to pick on Walmart because they're huge. But then you don't think about the Aldi's, or you don't think about the St. Croix crossings, and then they get the short end of the stick, so.
And the reality is that when you tell Walmart what you need, they'll give it to you.
Yeah,
I mean, they don't have the time or the energy to sit and fight. Just give them the rules and they'll work with it.
yeah.
You know, so it's the little guys that are gonna argue and hire their attorney and hire someone like me to come in and argue about it, you know?
We don't want that.
So we've talked about some revisions that Mr. Richards is going to work on. What do we want to do now?
I don't even know how to.
I want to wait and see what he comes back with. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where we're going to vote on it one of these times, but it ain't going to be today, I don't think. I'm not going to vote on it today.
I need a motion to what we're going to do next.
I'd like to make a motion that we've closed, before I make the motion, we've already closed the public hearing.
Correct.
I think that should stay closed, so I guess I want to recommend that make a motion that we have staff continue with the minor changes that we talked about today and bring it back to us at our next meeting. That's my motion.
A second?
So we have a motion and a second that the staff's going to continue to work on these revisions that we've discussed today, bring it forward at the next meeting, which would be, anybody know what that one is in April?
Our April meeting.
13th.
April 13th. Do we have any additional discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
I
All those opposed, same sign. Motion passes.
Just trying to do make work here.
All right. That was some good discussion. Thanks, everybody. And I really appreciate all the work you've been doing, Mr. Richards. This has been a fun one.
Yeah, it actually has been kind of interesting to look at.
Reminds me of the comp plan.
All right, we're moving on to new business. We have
Which
a
I know
couple.
was your point.
We have a couple new business things to discuss. We have, I guess we can talk about Commissioner Freeman. Do we want to put forth a recommendation to the city council for a 1-year extension for Mr. Freeman? Or do we want to, what do we want to do? We got some options here, and I guess we can kind of talk about the recommendation for Mr. Kramer as well. Or do we want to put it out for another 30 days? What do we want to do from that
So-
perspective?
Let's go point by point. I just want to hear from Mr. Freeman. You know, we can hold your feet to the fire, but there's a recommendation that we can make to keep you on the bench.
Well,
Just curious,
the
are
city
you,
staff asked me to write something saying whether I'm interested or not, and I did. I wrote a letter saying I'm interested.
okay,
But that being said, the reason why I'm interested is because right now we're down one person. So if that wasn't the case, I might have said, no, I don't really want to do this any longer. I think it is good for having some turnover, you know, so.
So
I mean, I've been doing it.
Question of staff.
I don't know how many years I've been doing it, but a while.
Did the planning commission vacancies ever go out in a newsletter yet?
Okay, so if I could just dial it. So, if we deal with Commissioner Freeman's position
Yep.
first, for example, so terms come, terms go, his is ending his second term. we asked if Mr. Freeman would be interested in serving another term. He was kind enough to send me an email, which is pretty much I need for the record. And so if you would like to make a recommendation to support that possibility to the city council, you don't have to. It's just, if something you'd like to do, you may. And that kind of stands on its own.
Okay, so let's move forward with that topic at hand at this point.
I think the important thing here is that the planning commission doesn't get to pick.
Goes to the city council.
Makes the
This is
decision.
only
so-
a recommendation to the city council.
So then we could just,
See, we love Tim Freeman. He's done a wonderful job.
we can either
And-
endorse it or not, and if we don't say anything at all, they can make a choice.
Correct.
I need a motion to send forth a recommendation to the city council for,
Motion to send forth a recommendation to the city council to extend a one-year extension to Tim Freeman.
do I have a second?
Second,
All right.
It sounded begrudging, didn't it?
I have a comment.
Do we have any additional discussion?
The only discussion would be, should there be a clause that says if somebody applies in the year, that he doesn't have to go a full year? Because if we're going to open the position versus extend his,
If he chooses to resign in that mid course, we'll deal with that.
but so maybe to phrase it a different way, should there be a posting indefinitely, for the entire year instead of 30-day windows at a time to say there's a spot?
No, I think if he's offered
wouldn't.
to serve one more year, he serves one more year.
There we go.
Leave it at that.
Okay, so point of clarification. Our terms run May to May,
Correct.
correct?
We've had over the years just some wiggle room in those by a month or so, but fundamentally May to May. Yes.
Okay.
I think mine was that kind of exception.
Yeah,
Just
it
to
depends when
stagger
people
those.
come and go. We try to align them with some overlap, so.
So I'm going to propose a friendly amendment to Ms. Van Dyke's motion that we recommend to the city council, Commissioner Freeman serves until May 2024.
Isn't that a year? Well, it's a little more than a year.
A little more than a year.
So I amended my previous comment, or my previous recommendation to the city council for Tim's one-year extension from May to May 24.
So you're accepting his
I am
amendment?
accepting your amendment.
All right, so,
second.
so we have a motion on the floor that we're going to recommend to the city council that Commissioner Freeman serves an additional year accumulating in May 2024 on the planning commission. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign.
Did you vote?
No, I abstained. Oh, motion passes.
You abstained?
Didn't say anything out loud, we're fine. Motion passes.
So Blake, it's-
Yep. Okay, so now I'm going to ask my question of staff. Since we've had our commissioner step down, has that
No.
posting been posted in the mailing?
In the city's newsletter, no, because we haven't had one. It's coming out at the end of March.
All right, so I'm going to be, before we talk about a recommendation for Mr. Kramer, I'm going to propose that part of the recommendation for Mr. Kramer, because he is a new position, that we at least allow the posting to exist in the city mailing one time before making a recommendation to the city council.
And that's a statement that you're making?
I'm asking for some discussion about it before we,
I have an opinion about this, and I'd like to make a motion about it, but I'm going to wait till we talk about it. I think that he's certainly demonstrated his abilities to serve on this planning commission. I think that we should have him serve as soon as possible. So waiting for it to come out in the newsletter doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think that that should still go out in the newsletter so that we get names on a list of people that might be interested. But I think that operating with only 4 members, there's really no reason to do that. I don't think. So I'd just as soon see the planning commission make a recommendation to the city council that they can do both these things at the same time. But that's how I feel about it. So
I struggle with the mailing, because if you send that out there you're staying on a year, so assuming the city council approves it, assuming they will, then you get somebody that's excited and they have to wait 365 days. So I'm torn on putting it out if we take on Mr. Kramer, and then why would we put out a posting just to have people sit on a waiting list?
You wouldn't. That's my take on it is I don't think people know there's an opening for the planning commission except for word of mouth because it hasn't been publicly put anywhere. It's not even on the website unless you dig, right? So I don't.
Well,
think,
it's true, but there's a lot of data out there, to be
right.
fair.
No, there's data out there. I just think that in any public appointed position, not that Mr. Kramer is not fully qualified, not that Mr. Kramer is not a phenomenal individual and fully capable. I just feel like in city politics, you end up with a consistent rotation, and it would be nice to at least put it out in the mailing one time and see if we get any new applicants. We function this way for 2 months. We can function this way for 1 more month through April, which means we put forth a recommendation in May, which fits perfectly with our periods of elections. So I guess I would make a motion that we publish it 1 month in the newsletter and move forth a recommendation for the open seat in April.
Second.
So that was a motion?
My motion.
Second.
Oh,
I have a motion and a second. Do we have more discussion?
I like Mr. Kramer,
no,
but I mean, yeah, I think we should need to have it open for somebody. I don't understand why Tim's position couldn't be more flexible if somebody showed up. Or he could step now.
my position personally is that if somebody comes forward and wants to be on the planning commission, I'm out of here. You know what I mean? But
See, I'd rather, I'm 100% on board with that. Get it out in the public, and then if somebody signs up and they interview well and we think it's a good fit, then Tim can cut his contract and we take on a new person.
It's just not. It's the problem is that it's not the way elected positions work. You're either elected or you're not, and then you can step down. It's
not an elected position.
It's appointed
This is an
position,
appointed position, and there's a big difference.
but you still
Huge difference.
You're still appointed for a period of time, Mr. Freeman.
Okay, but the issue is that when somebody resigns, you're going to have this 3-month lag period before you can get somebody else on board. And I know that we're not, backed up with all these projects we're waiting to try and deal with, but it seems silly to make the process any more difficult than it needs to be, especially when we have an applicant that's qualified and wants to get going. And we'll jump right on board and be productive and making us crazy right from the get-go,
So then,
that's how I feel.
so Mr. Freeman, I think agreeing that he's qualified, a great person that should come on, fill the spot right away, agree with that completely. The appointed position element to this is, even if we do put it out there in the public in March, and to Blake's point, you'd be on for the next year no matter what.
I'll be on until I resign, I'll tell you that right now. And if somebody, maybe the way to do this is to amend it to say that the city, if we make a recommendation tonight, like I said, to appoint, recommend to the city that they appoint Jim Kramer, and also put it out there. And if we get a qualified applicant, I'm happy to step aside.
Well, there's
I just don't like the idea of having openings that last for 3 months.
The process issue here is, to Commissioner Husby's point, is if you do put it out there for the 3rd or the 5th vacancy after 30 days or whatever, and you get 2 or 3 applicants that the commission likes, then including Mr. Kramer, and then there's maybe another person that you think is great. Okay. Hey, that's way you can make a recommendation to the council, and if council, you like both of those two, Mr. Freeman's willing to step down. But until you know those people are in hand, you don't want to have this other vacancy. So it kind of locks you up for for a known period of time and gives you the city ability to plan accordingly. But as it relates to Mr. Kramer's possibility, that's a different issue. And that's more or less up to your recommendation, how you might want to slice that.
So you have a motion, a second
We
on the
have a
table.
motion and a second on the
And-
table. Do we have any additional discussion?
And I did not catch, so Blake made the motion, was it Jen that made the second? That's what, okay, I'm just making sure that Julia has this right, so.
So do we have any other additional discussion, or should I call for a vote?
I guess I'm just going to say that I'm going to vote against this.
All right, I'm going to call for a vote. All those in favor of the motion on the table, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
I
All those opposed, please signify same sign.
Same sign.
Okay, so we have 3 ayes and 1
What he said, wasn't
against.
State your name.
Got it.
All right.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. That's what we're here for. Good discussion. I think it's good discussion. I think it's a challenge in city administration and politics to have. It's just a difficult thing when people.
But
step
just so
down.
that I'm clear now, we made the recommendation to appoint me for another year, but we decided to make a recommendation not to accept Mr. Kramer at this time.
So the 2 recommendations that are moving towards to the city council on whatever, is it the 28th, I would guess, probably? So the 28th, so the first one, we recommended to the city council to appoint you for another 1-year extension of your term on the planning commission. And then we made a recommendation that we would like to post the other open position in the newsletter for one time and give it a cycle, and we will revisit the applicants in the April meeting.
Right.
Those are the 2 recommendations we sent towards to the city
Can you
council.
wait for another month? Oh, don't.
is vacancy letter .13 is what we're taking to the city.
Yep,
Specifically, post it for a month.
yep, post it for a month, that's all we're asking. All right, do we have any old business that we want to talk about?
Heat islands.
Heat islands, no, we're done with that for the night. All right, informational, we've got some upcoming meetings. It looks like, is there anything special? Maybe find them.
Well, I can go to city
On the
council
list
on the
of
28th.
additional meetings.
Yep. Then it looks like Commissioner Husby's gonna be at the meeting on March 28th.
Yep.
And Mr. Freeman, you're good for April 25th? So
Well,
far,
unless they don't,
unless they don't appoint you, I guess? All right, we'll find out.
Wouldn't that be fun?
All right. All right, so do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right, do we have any discussion? Do we want to talk about anything
No,
else?
let's please.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
nay.
Eric, are all the park spots filled? Because that might be the other thing.
No, I think,
Posting.
no, I think there's one opening.